building an indie business in the center of venture capital. I am Alex Edmonds, also known as SupremeRumHam on the internet, and this is the Building an Indie Business podcast. Alright, so this is the 78th episode of the podcast, and that means I've been doing the podcast for 18 months, and so I thought to keep it light for this episode that I would give you interesting data points for the podcast. Okay. First, I wanted to mention that the book is now live and not in pre-order. So you can go to the link in the show notes, use the discount code BAIB, all lower cap, and get the book for free. So if you'd like to read it, go get it. Okay, so interesting data points. So I'm going to start with the top episodes of the podcast. The first episode with the most downloads, I'm going to go over the top 5. The first episode with the most downloads is the dog and web development episode. And this episode, it keeps going back and forth with the build your first idea episode. So yeah, apparently dogs are very popular. Who knew? And that experiment worked, so keep that in mind for your content. The third episode is, the third episode is the coffee and web development episode. So apparently coffee is very popular. Next is the trailer, just because it's the first thing you hear with the podcast. And the fifth episode is the 1% rule. Seems like people are very interested in productivity. Okay. So, another data point that I've learned is that people don't listen to the podcast the very first week. They listen weeks later. So there was a time where I did not promote the podcast, and I would only get 30 downloads in the first week. And then a couple weeks later, I'd look at the number of downloads for the podcast. For that episode, sorry, I was drinking water. And what would happen is that amount of downloads would grow organically. So I would have like 50 downloads for that episode in like 2 weeks later. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. The most used app to listen to the podcast is Overcast. And that is because I use Overcast to promote the episode. Lately, I've been using Google Podcasts. So yeah, because I like how Google Podcasts will show the show notes and the podcast episode description. So yeah, I have an average download number of 50. So the average listener amount is 50. Most downloads in 1 week is 466. Yes. Most downloads in a day is 106. Yeah. And one thing about that downloads in a day is that was a day that I was at work. So it was just like a Tuesday, not a Monday, when the podcast is released, or a new episode is released. It was just like a Tuesday. So I had not done any promoting. Okay. 60% of the listeners, over 60% of the listeners are in France, which is kind of weird. Not weird, but yeah, that's why, and every once in a while I'll say hello to all my listeners in France. Why this is weird is because I don't really know anyone in France, so I don't know how the podcast caught on in France. So yeah, I would like to know though. So if you are in France and you I would like to know how you found my podcast. So you can email me, SupremeRumHam@gmail.com. You could tweet me, SupremeRumHam, or you can message me on Telegram, SupremeRumHam again. Okay. 19% of the listeners are in the U.S., which makes sense because that's the area where I am in. So people who access every place where I promote the podcast at 6 a.m. when I promote the podcast, my podcast episodes will be the top thing that they see. So if they have an interest, they'll click on it, and that happens every week. So I'm surprised that it's not reverse, where 60% of the listeners are in the US and 19% of the listeners are in France. Okay. The biggest fan of the podcast is my mother. No, I'm just joking. She doesn't listen to the podcast. Okay. Next thing. The longest episode of the podcast is the interview with Brendan Weinstein. That's about 46 minutes. The shortest episode is the Minds.com episode at 3 minutes and 48 seconds. I shouldn't even have done that episode in my opinion, because I clearly didn't have enough to say about it. But you'll learn. So, the longest solo episode is the book review of Evil by Design at a little over 26 minutes. Yeah, that book was like 500 pages, and not 500 pages in a traditional like 8 by 8 book. It was my hand, like my entire hand could fit on the cover, and it was still 500 pages. It was insane, and I kept going through the book while I was doing the episode. So yeah, that's another reason why that episode is so long. Okay. Every podcast episode has been recorded in California, specifically in San Jose. Yeah, so, yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about that. That's just what it is. Okay. The next interesting podcast fact is that it took me 12 months to reach 5,000 downloads, 53 episodes specifically, and it took me 4 months to go from 5,000 downloads to 10,000 downloads. So yeah, I turned 27 episodes of the podcast into a book. So yeah, the book is basically a written version of the podcast, but I take out some ideas from the podcast episode, and I've added some ideas to almost every episode. Yeah, so there are things that I didn't think about before I recorded that while I was writing the episode, I thought about. Okay. I have scraped 2 episodes of the podcast, and only 2 episodes. The first episode was taking a break, and in this episode I talk about how I'm a little burned out from doing the podcast, and I don't have any ideas. But then right before I was about to record, I got an idea for an episode that week instead, and I haven't had any problems since, so I don't need that episode. I think I even deleted it. Okay. The second episode that I've scraped is History of the Industry, which is in the book. So it would be 28 episodes of the podcast would be a book if I didn't scrape this episode. I just really didn't like it. I was kind of just listing facts of the podcast industry. Like George Bush had a podcast, and he was the first U.S. president to have a podcast. The first podcast was started in 2003. The first podcast host was Libsyn in 2004. So I just didn't really see any value in it. It wasn't fun. It wasn't very informative to people. It was kind of short, and I don't like having short episodes anymore. I try to keep them at least 10 minutes and under 30. So yeah. The next fun fact of the podcast is I've edited around 2 minutes of the entire podcast. So I have about 25 hours of audio content, and I've only edited 2 minutes of it. Probably less than that, around 2 minutes. So what I've edited in this podcast is two things. I've edited out water noises, so when I go for a drink on occasion, it makes a sound into the mic, and it just sounds weird. I don't like it, so I edit it out. And then I sometimes will edit out dead air, mostly at the end of the podcast, when I just don't click the button, like the stop recording button, quick enough, just so that I don't have on purpose dead air. No, accidental dead air. Alright, so last two facts. I've done 2 interviews of the podcast, but the rest are solo. So yeah, and the last fact is I've had 0 underwear subscription ads, which almost a lot of podcasts have an underwear subscription ad, and I'm very proud that this podcast doesn't. So yeah. Alright, that's all I have for this episode. I appreciate everyone who's listened to the podcast. If you have an interest in starting a podcast, there's the Open Podcast Community Podcast, where if you record an episode on your own, you send me the audio, send me what you want in the show notes, and I will add it to the Open Podcast Community Podcast RSS feed, and so you will have the experience of podcasting without going through all the hassle, because I've already done that for you. Okay, and there's the Open Podcast blog, where if you would like to write about any experience you have in podcasting, where you record an episode, your first episode, for the Open Podcast Community Podcast, and you want to share your experience doing that, I will give you author's access to the Open Podcast blog, and you will be able to post it there. Okay, thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Bye.